I woke up because something cold touched my foot, and for a moment I thought I was dreaming. The room was dark, the house silent, the kind of silence that only exists after midnight. Then I heard a whisper so weak it barely sounded human. "Mom, please don't turn on the light." My heart began to race as I looked down and saw my daughter on the floor, crawling toward my bed. Her hair was tangled, her face swollen, her arms shaking as if every movement hurt. She looked like someone who had escaped a disaster, not like the woman who had left this house smiling as a newly married bride. I wanted to scream, to turn on the light, to run for help, but she clutched my leg with trembling fingers and begged me to stay quiet. In that moment, fear wrapped itself around my chest, because I knew before she said a single word that whatever her husband had done to her was something no parent should ever have to witness. As I gently pulled her onto the bed, my hands shook so badly I could barely hold her. When I finally turned on the bedside lamp, the truth hit me like a physical blow. Dark bruises covered her arms and neck, her lip was split, and her eyes carried a terror I had only ever seen in nightmares. She tried to hide her face, apologizing over and over, as if what had happened to her was somehow her fault. I kept asking her what happened, who did this, why she hadn't called me sooner, but she stayed silent, staring at the wall, as if speaking would shatter her completely. I realized then how blind I had been. All those phone calls where she said she was fine, all those visits where her smile never reached her eyes, I had believed every lie, because I wanted to believe her marriage was safe and happy. That night, as she lay curled beside me like a frightened child, I felt my heart break in ways I didn't know were possible. I thought about the day I had placed her hand into her husband's, trusting him to protect her when I no longer could. I remembered defending him when small doubts crept into my mind, telling myself I was overthinking, that marriage was hard for everyone. Now, sitting in the dim light, watching my daughter struggle to breathe through her pain, I understood a terrible truth: my silence, my hesitation. My refusal to ask hard questions had allowed her suffering to grow in the dark. And as the clock ticked past midnight, I knew that the story she was about to tell me would change everything: her life, my life, and the meaning of trust forever. She didn't cry at first. That frightened me more than the bruises. My daughter lay stiff beside me on the bed, staring at the wall as if it were safer than looking at her own mother. I wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, not because the room was cold, but because she wouldn't stop shaking. Her body trembled in short, uneven waves, like she was bracing for something that hadn't happened yet. Every few seconds she flinched, as if expecting footsteps in the hallway, a door slamming open, a voice yelling her name. I realized then that fear had followed her into my home. I whispered her name again and again, softly, the way I used to when she was a child afraid of thunderstorms. "You're safe," I told her, though part of me didn't fully believe it yet. Safety felt fragile, temporary, like glass that could shatter with one loud sound. Slowly, she turned her head toward me. Her eyes were red, not from crying, but from holding tears back for too long. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse, almost unfamiliar. "He said if I ever told you, he'd finish it." Those words sliced through me. Finish it. I didn't ask what she meant. I already knew. I reached for her hand and felt her recoil instinctively before forcing herself to relax. That single movement broke something inside me. My daughter had learned to fear touch. Even love had become dangerous to her. I asked her if she needed a doctor. She shook her head quickly, panic flashing across her face. "No hospitals, please. He knows people there." I didn't question it. Abuse teaches victims to believe their abuser is everywhere, watching, waiting, instead. I got a damp cloth and gently cleaned the blood from her lip. She winced but didn't pull away. Each bruise told a story. She wasn't ready to speak yet. Finger-shaped marks on her arm, a deep purple shadow along her collarbone, scratches that looked like desperate attempts to protect herself. Minutes passed. Then more. The clock ticked loudly in the silence, every second stretching like a warning. Finally, she whispered, "I didn't mean to wake you." That's when the anger hit me hot, uncontrollable, and terrifying in its intensity. My child had been beaten and still felt the need to apologize. I told her she never had to be sorry for coming to me. Not ever. Her lips trembled, and at last, tears spilled down her cheeks, silent but relentless. She buried her face into my chest, and I felt years of pain pour out of her in that single moment. She cried like someone who had been drowning and had finally reached air. I held her tighter, afraid that if I let go, she would disappear again. When she was calmer, I asked the question I had been avoiding. "What happened tonight?" Her body stiffened. For a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer. Then she swallowed hard and said, "I tried to leave, just for words, but they carried the weight of everything that followed." She told me he came home angry, more than usual. The dinner was cold. The house wasn't clean enough. She looked at him the wrong way. It never mattered what the reason was, there was always one. When she mentioned staying with me for a few days, just to cool things down, his face changed. She said his eyes went empty, like something inside him switched off. That was when she knew it would be bad. He took her phone first. Then the keys. Then he locked the door. As she spoke, her voice remained strangely calm, like she was narrating someone else's life. She told me how he pushed her, how she hit the wall, how she begged him to stop. She didn't describe everything, but she didn't have to. Every pause, every shake in her breath filled in the gaps. At one point, she stopped talking altogether and stared at her hands, as if seeing the memory written there. I didn't push her. I just listened, my nails digging into my palms as I fought the urge to drive back to that house and confront him immediately. She escaped only because he fell asleep drunk. She waited, barely breathing, then crawled across the floor so the bed wouldn't creak. She found an old spare key hidden outside, one he had forgotten about. She didn't run. She said running felt too loud. Instead, she walked barefoot through the night, every shadow terrifying her. Every passing car making her flinch. She didn't know where else to go. She only knew she had to. Get to me. When she finished, the room felt smaller, heavier. The truth had filled every corner. I kissed her forehead and promised her something I should have promised sooner. Auntie, let him touch you again. She nodded, but I could see doubt in her eyes. Promises had been broken before. As dawn crept in through the curtains, I realized this was no longer just about comforting my daughter. This was the beginning of a fight I hadn't known I needed to prepare for. One that would test my courage, my values, and my understanding of what it truly means to protect your child, and deep down. I knew this was only the first layer of a much darker truth still waiting to surface. By morning, the house looked the same as it always had, but nothing inside me was familiar anymore. Sunlight spilled into the kitchen, birds chirped outside, and the world carried on as if nothing had happened. My daughter sat at the table, staring into a cup of untouched tea, her hands wrapped around it for warmth. She looked exhausted, older somehow, as if one night had added years to her face. Watching her there, quiet and fragile, my mind drifted backward to the beginning, to the man I had once trusted without hesitation, when she first introduced him to us. He seemed almost perfect. Polite, well-spoken, respectful, he shook my husband's hand firmly, looked me straight in the eyes, and called me ma'am with a smile that felt sincere. He brought flowers, remembered birthdays, helped clear the dishes after dinner. Everyone said the same thing. She was lucky. I remember the pride I felt. The relief that my daughter had found someone who appeared stable, caring, responsible. In hindsight, that relief was dangerous. It made me stop looking closely. They dated for 2 years before marrying, and during that time, any concern I had was easy to dismiss. He didn't like her going out late with friends, but I told myself he was protective. He called her frequently, but that was just love, wasn't it? When she slowly stopped visiting as often, I assumed marriage had simply made her busy. I didn't recognize control when it wore the mask of concern. None of us did. The wedding day plays in my mind now like a cruel trick. She was radiant, smiling so brightly that it erased every doubt I had ever carried. He held her hand tightly during the ceremony, and I remember thinking how devoted he looked. What I didn't realize was that his grip was never meant to loosen. That day wasn't the beginning of a partnership, it was the beginning of her isolation. The changes didn't come all at once. That's how abuse survives. It grows slowly, quietly. Like a shadow stretching across the floor while no one is watching. Phone calls became shorter. Visits became rare. When I asked how she was doing, her answers were rehearsed. Good, just tired. Everything's fine, Mom. Sometimes I heard something in her voice, hesitation, strain. But every time I tried to press further, she brushed it off. You worry too much, she'd say, smiling just enough to make me feel foolish. Looking back, the signs were there. She stopped wearing certain clothes. She asked my permission before making plans, even though she was a grown woman. Once during a family gathering, I noticed a bruise on her arm. She laughed it off, saying she had bumped into a door. I believed her because believing her was easier than imagining the alternative. A mother wants to trust her child's happiness, even when instinct whispers otherwise. As she sat across from me that morning, I finally asked the question I should have asked years ago. When did it start? Her fingers tightened around the mug. She didn't answer right away. Then she said softly, "Not when you think." She told me the first time he hurt her wasn't with his hands. It was with words, constant criticism disguised as jokes. You're too sensitive, you're lucky I put up with you. Slowly, he chipped away at her confidence, convincing her that no one else would love her the way he did. He isolated her from friends, turning every invitation into an argument, every outing into guilt. By the time the first slap happened, she already believed she deserved it. She told me how she cried afterward, how he apologized, how he swore it would never happen again. He brought flowers, cooked dinner, held her while she shook. She said she believed him because she wanted to. Because admitting the truth felt like admitting failure. Because she didn't want to come back home and explain that her marriage, the one everyone admired, was a lie. My chest ached as she spoke. Each sentence felt like a confession I should have demanded sooner. She told me about the rules he set, who she could talk to, where she could go, how long she could stay out. About how fear slowly replaced love, and how survival became her only goal. She learned to read his moods, to adjust her behavior, to disappear inside herself just to keep the peace. I thought if I tried harder, he'd change, she whispered. That sentence broke me, because I realized how deeply his control had rewritten her reality. He didn't just hurt her body, he reshaped her mind. I reached across the table and held her hands, seeing them not as the hands of a married woman, but as the hands of the little girl I once tucked into bed. And for the first time, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my guilt. I had trusted him. I had encouraged patience. I had told her marriage was about compromise, never imagining she was compromising her safety, her dignity, her life. That morning, as the sun climbed higher, I understood something terrifying. And irreversible, the man I welcomed into my family had been slowly destroying my daughter right in front of us. And the worst part was knowing that while the abuse began quietly, it had never truly stopped. It had only been waiting, growing bolder, darker, until the night she crawled into my room, broken and desperate, with nowhere left to run, and deep inside. I knew the hardest chapters were still ahead. By the third day, my daughter finally slept through the night, but I didn't. I lay awake listening to every sound, every creak of the house, my mind replaying memories I could no longer ignore. The image of her husband, the man I once defended, now felt like a stranger wearing a familiar face. I realized something chilling. He hadn't changed. He had always been this way. We just hadn't been looking closely enough. When I thought back, the warning signs were there from the beginning. Scattered like breadcrumbs I had stepped over without noticing, he had always needed to be the center of every room. Conversations bent toward him, compliments were expected, not appreciated. If someone disagreed with him, his smile would tighten just slightly, his eyes hardening for a split second before he laughed it off. At the time, I dismissed it as confidence. Now I recognized it as control. My daughter told me more that afternoon. Her voice steadier, but her eyes distant, as if she were watching herself from far away. She said he hated being questioned. Even innocent curiosity could turn into an interrogation. Why do you need to know? He'd snap. Over time, she learned silence was safer. Agreeing was easier. Existing quietly was the only way to survive. She described the way he monitored her, checking her phone, reading her messages, demanding passwords under the excuse of trust. If she hesitated, he accused her of hiding something. Trust, to him, meant ownership. Love meant obedience. And slowly, without realizing it, she gave up pieces of herself just to avoid his anger. What hurt the most was hearing how carefully he had hidden his cruelty from everyone else around. Family and friends, he was charming, generous, attentive. He remembered anniversaries, offered help, spoke proudly of his wife. No one would have believed her if she had spoken earlier, and he knew it. Abusers build reputations like shields. And he had perfected his. She told me about dinners where he would squeeze her knee under the table if she spoke too much, about car rides where silence was mandatory because the wrong tone could trigger hours of rage, about the way he could destroy her with words alone, calling her useless, weak, ungrateful, then act offended when she cried. I started to think I really was the problem, she said quietly. That sentence settled into my chest like a stone. I remembered a time she had called me late at night, her voice tense, asking if she could come over the next day. Before I could ask why, she said never mind. He had just walked into the room. I remembered how she stopped laughing the way she used to, how her light dimmed gradually. Not suddenly, making it easier to explain away. Abuse doesn't arrive like a storm, it arrives like fog, slow, quiet, and suffocating. Anger rose in me like fire, not just at him, but at myself. I had been so careful raising my daughter, teaching her right from wrong, telling her she deserved respect, yet somehow she had ended up trapped in a life where fear ruled everything. I wanted to believe I could have prevented it, that one question asked sooner might have saved her years of pain. That guilt sat heavy in my chest, refusing to move. That evening, the phone rang. An unknown number. My heart dropped instantly. I knew it was him before I answered. His voice was calm, controlled, almost polite. She left, he said, as if she were a misplaced object. If she's with you, tell her to come home. This is a private matter. Something inside me shifted then. The fear I had carried for days turned into clarity. I told him she was safe. I told him not to contact her again. For the first time, his voice cracked. Not with remorse, with rage barely contained. "You're making a mistake," he said. "You don't know what she's really like." I hung up without responding. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. That call confirmed everything my daughter had told me. He wasn't worried about her, he was worried about losing control. When I told her about the call, she went pale. "He always says that," she whispered, "that no one would believe me, that I'd ruin everything if I talked." I looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw how deeply his words had rooted themselves inside her. Abuse doesn't end when the bruises fade, it lingers in the mind, rewriting reality. That night, I made a decision. No more silence. No more patience. No more excuses. The man who had broken my daughter would no longer hide behind charm or marriage or reputation. Whatever came next, confrontation, legal battles, judgment from others, we would face it together, because this wasn't just her story anymore, it was mine too. And I was done being afraid of the truth. The next morning, I found my daughter standing in the bathroom, staring at her reflection as if she didn't recognize the woman looking back at her. She traced the fading bruise along her jaw with her fingertip. Her expression blank. "I used to practice smiling," she said suddenly, without turning around, in the mirror, just to make sure no one would ask questions. My throat tightened. The idea that my child had trained herself to hide pain felt like a second kind of violence, quieter, but just as cruel. She sat on the edge of the bed afterward and began to talk again, slowly, carefully, like someone walking across broken glass. This time, she didn't focus on the worst moments. She talked about the in-between days, the ones that confused her the most. The days when he was kind, when he apologized, promised therapy, promised change, when he cooked dinner, bought gifts, held her and cried about his own childhood, his stress, his anger issues. Those days were the trap. Those were the days that made me stay, she said, because they made me believe the bad days were my fault. She explained how every act of cruelty was followed by affection, how every threat was softened with excuses. He would tell her he loved her too much, that jealousy was proof of devotion. That anger was only because he cared, over time. Love and fear tangled together until she couldn't tell them apart. She stopped trusting her instincts. If something felt wrong, he convinced her it was her imagination. If she cried, he accused her of manipulation. Slowly, her sense of reality eroded. I asked her why she never told me. Not even once, not even a hint. She looked at me then, tears welling up, and said, "Because I didn't want you to look at me like I was broken." That sentence shattered me. She had carried unbearable pain just to protect me from worry, just to preserve the illusion that everything was fine. She told me about the night she almost left before. She had packed a small bag, hidden it in the trunk of her car. When he found it, he didn't hit her. He laughed. He told her no one would help her, that she had no money, no strength, no future without him. He reminded her how much everyone admired him, how foolish she would look trying to destroy a marriage everyone envied. Then he unpacked the bag in front of her, item by item, explaining why each thing was useless. That night, she put the bag away and never tried again, until now. As she spoke, I realized something horrifying. The abuse wasn't just physical, it was psychological warfare. He had stripped her of confidence, independence, and hope with surgical precision. Bruises heal, this kind of damage lingers. That afternoon, I helped her shower. She insisted on doing it alone, but I stayed nearby, just in case. When she came out, wrapped in a towel, she looked lighter somehow, not healed, but relieved, clean, as if washing away a layer of fear. I gave her one of my old sweaters, and she smiled faintly. It smells like home, she said. That small sentence felt like victory, but peace didn't last long. By evening, messages began appearing on her phone, dozens of them. Apologies. Accusations. Threats disguised as concern. Come home, we can fix this. You're embarrassing me. Your mother is poisoning you against me. Each message tightened the knot in my chest. He was trying to pull her back into the cycle, using guilt as bait. She started shaking again. He always does this, she whispered. If I don't answer, it gets worse. I took the phone from her hands and turned it off. It stops now, I said firmly, though fear pulsed through me too. I didn't know what he was capable of, but I knew this, he would not reach her through me. That night, she had a nightmare. She screamed his name, her body thrashing as if she were trapped again. I held her until she woke, gasping, disoriented. She clung to me like a child, apologizing through sobs. I'm sorry, she kept saying. I told her something I wished she had heard years earlier. You did nothing wrong, nothing. As dawn approached, I realized that saving her wasn't just about keeping her away from him, it was about helping her. Remember who she was before fear took over. Before love became something to survive instead of something to feel. This chapter of her life wasn't over yet, but for the first time, she wasn't facing it alone. And I made another promise to myself, quietly, fiercely, whatever it takes, however long it lasts, I will not let her be pulled back into the darkness. Because a mother's love doesn't end at comfort. Sometimes it begins with a fight. The following days blurred together, marked by exhaustion, whispered conversations, and an unspoken fear that followed us from room to room, even in safety. My daughter moved as if danger could strike at any moment. She walked softly, checked locks twice. Flinched when the doorbell rang. Trauma had taught her that peace was temporary. I watched her closely, realizing that saving her life meant more than offering shelter. It meant dismantling the fear that had rewired her existence. On the fourth day, she finally agreed to see a doctor. Not because she wanted to, but because the pain had become impossible to ignore. I sat in the waiting room while she was examined, my hands clenched tightly in my lap. When the doctor came out, her expression was gentle but serious. Some injuries were older than others, repeated trauma, nothing life-threatening, she said, but the words echoed cruelly in my head. Nothing life-threatening, as if survival alone were enough, at home. We talked about next steps, police, lawyers, restraining orders. Each word felt heavy, dangerous. My daughter listened quietly, then shook her head. If I do that, he'll come after us, she said. He always said the law wouldn't help me. That he'd make sure of it. I realized how deeply he had poisoned her trust in the world. He hadn't just isolated her from people, he had isolated her from help itself. That night, the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the house like glass. My daughter froze, eyes wide, breath caught in her throat. I felt my heart slam against my ribs. I told her to go into my room and lock the door. When I looked through the peephole, my blood ran cold. It was him. He stood there calmly, hands in his pockets, wearing the same jacket I had once complimented. He smiled when he saw me. I just want to talk, he said softly, as if he were the reasonable one, as if he hadn't shattered my daughter's life. I didn't open the door. I told him to leave, he sighed. Shaking his head like I was being dramatic. She's confused, he said, you're making it worse. That was when the anger finally broke through my fear. I told him he was no longer welcome, that if he didn't leave, I would call the police. His smile vanished. For a split second, his eyes revealed the man my daughter knew, cold, furious, dangerous. This isn't over, he said quietly before turning away. When I locked the door, my hands were shaking uncontrollably. My daughter came out of the room slowly, her face pale. "He found me," she whispered. I pulled her into my arms and realized something terrifying and empowering all at once. Hiding was no longer enough. He wouldn't stop. The only way forward was through him. The next morning, we went to the police together. She held my hand the entire time, gripping it so tightly my fingers went numb. Telling her story was like reopening a wound, but this time she wasn't alone. She stumbled over words, broke down in tears, apologized unnecessarily, but she told the truth, and for the first time, someone wrote it down, officially, permanently. The process was slow and humiliating, questions that felt invasive, doubt disguised as procedure. But when the officer finally said, "You did the right thing," my daughter cried harder than I had ever seen. Validation can feel like oxygen after years of suffocation. A temporary restraining order was issued that afternoon. It wasn't a guarantee of safety, but it was a line drawn in ink instead of fear. When we got home, she stood in the doorway, staring at the paper in her hands. "I never thought I'd see this," she said. "I thought I'd either go back or disappear." That evening, we really talked, about the future, about rebuilding, about therapy, about a life that didn't revolve around surviving someone else's anger. She admitted she didn't know who she was without him telling her what to be. That broke my heart. But it also gave me hope. Because identities can be rebuilt, lives can be reclaimed. Later that night, as she slept on the couch beside me, I watched her chest rise and fall steadily. For the first time since she arrived at my door. Her face was calm, not healed, but resting, and I understood then that the most dangerous moment for an abuser is when control is lost. He would try again, in ways subtle or loud, but this time we were ready. I wasn't just her mother anymore. I was her shield, her witness, her voice when fear tried to silence her again. And whatever came next, courtrooms, accusations, whispered judgments, I would face it without hesitation, because some chapters of motherhood don't end when your child grows up. Some begin when she comes crawling back to you, broken but alive, asking not just for comfort, but for courage, and I was ready to give her both. The days after the restraining order were tense, but quieter. A fragile peace settled over the house. My daughter moved with more confidence, but the shadows of fear still lingered in her eyes. Even safe behind locked doors. Trauma had taught her that danger could appear anywhere, every knock at the door. Every unfamiliar car passing outside made her flinch. I realized then that survival wasn't about escaping him physically anymore. It was about reclaiming her mind, her sense of safety, her life. We spent the morning slowly, savoring small victories. She prepared breakfast without trembling. She laughed at small jokes. She even looked at herself in the mirror and smiled faintly, a real smile, not the rehearsed one she had perfected to survive. Those moments felt miraculous after the terror she had endured. But in the back of my mind, I knew the danger hadn't disappeared. He was still out there, waiting, watching, plotting. One afternoon, she finally opened up about the night she had fled. I had heard some details, but she hadn't told me everything. Her voice trembled, but her words painted a picture more harrowing than I could have imagined. He had cornered her in the living room, his face twisted with rage, demanding obedience. She tried to reason with him, to placate him, to become invisible in her own home. Nothing worked. And when he finally struck, she realized running wasn't a choice anymore, survival was. She had packed lightly, timed his sleep, and crawled through the darkness, clinging to each shadow as a lifeline. Every step was calculated, every breath a prayer. She paused, swallowing hard. "If you hadn't been here, Mom, I don't know if I would have made it." Her hands shook as she gripped mine. I didn't speak. Words would have failed me. Instead, I held her close, letting her feel the certainty that she was no longer alone. That she was no longer prey to the man who had stolen her years. We began documenting everything he had done: messages, photos, bruises, witness accounts. Each piece of evidence was a brick in the wall we were building between him and her life. I saw a subtle change in her with each document she handed me. There was power in being seen, in having her story acknowledged, in knowing the world could no longer ignore what he had done. For the first time in years, she felt the faint stirrings of control over her own fate, but he didn't stop trying. One morning, emails arrived. Polite, charming, insidious, "I just want to talk." He wrote, "I miss you. This is all a misunderstanding." My stomach twisted. I deleted them immediately, but the effect lingered. My daughter trembled when she saw the messages. The old fear resurfaced, the fear that the world outside our walls was not safe. I realized that protection wasn't just about locking doors. It was about teaching her the power of boundaries, the strength of saying no. The right to exist without fear. I encouraged her to speak openly with a counselor. At first, she resisted, believing she had no right to take up space with her trauma. Slowly, though, she began to unravel the tangled web of fear and shame that had consumed her. Each session peeled back a layer of his control. Each session reminded her that her feelings were valid, her life mattered, and she had the right to be angry, sad, scared, without judgment. One evening, I watched her sit on the balcony, the wind brushing against her face. The bruises were fading, but more importantly, she was beginning to reclaim herself. She told me about small dreams she had buried, finishing her degree, painting again, visiting friends she hadn't seen in years. For the first time, I heard hope in her voice. And for the first time, I felt that we had reached a turning point. Survival was no longer enough. She was beginning to live again. But closure required courage. We both knew confrontation was inevitable. He couldn't be allowed to linger in her life. No matter how subtle his attempts, the next steps, court hearings, restraining orders reinforced. Potential exposure to neighbors and family were frightening but necessary. She wasn't a victim to be hidden anymore. She was a survivor to be heard, protected, and believed. That night, as she slept peacefully for the first time in days, I sat by the window, thinking about the journey we had embarked on together. The road ahead was long, filled with challenges and reminders of what had been lost. But for the first time, I felt a sense of empowerment. The man who had haunted her life would no longer dictate her days. She had crawled into my room at midnight, broken and terrified, and now she would walk into her future, strong and determined. And I knew, with certainty, that no matter what came next, we were ready to face it together. The fight wasn't over, but we were no longer afraid. The story that began in darkness was slowly stepping into the light. The next morning, I watched my daughter step outside into the sunlight, her steps tentative but steady. Her bruises had faded, but the pain she carried would take longer to heal. Yet there was something in her eyes I hadn't seen for years, a spark, fragile but unmistakable, of hope and strength. She had crawled into my room at midnight, broken and terrified, and now she was beginning to reclaim her life. Every step forward was a victory, every small smile a triumph over the fear that had once ruled her days. I held her hands, feeling the tremor of the past beneath her fingers, and whispered what I had always wanted her to hear. "You are safe now, you are brave, and you are loved." She nodded, tears glimmering, not from pain, but from relief. From the realization that survival had turned into freedom, and fear had begun to be replaced by courage. Her journey reminds us all that even in the darkest nights, light can return, that silence protects abusers, not victims. That love isn't about waiting or hoping someone will change. It is about standing up, protecting, and never letting fear define your life. If this story moved you, remember to subscribe to our channel. Hit the bell icon so you never miss stories of survival, courage, and hope. Share this video to raise awareness and give strength to those who are still fighting in silence. Every view, every subscription helps bring voices like hers out of the shadows and into the light, because courage is contagious, hope is powerful, and together we can ensure no one has to face darkness alone.